third solve sessions. The solve sessions have really quickly become a core part of our global strategic and medical culture. It's become the centerpiece for inspiration and learning. The 2 weeks are inclusive of external thought leaders, followed by a week of our own Havas thought leaders. The theme for this program is closing the gap, spotlight on health inequities. I could not really think of a better or more appropriate theme. It's really become quickly part of the conversations we're having with clients and a key driver of what we see important for our clients' businesses and to support their brands and future growth aspirations. I've also had the pleasure of introducing our first presenter. And I've also gotten to know her already. We got to know each other quickly in our preparation for a panel that we jointly held at Cannes back in June, which was a phenomenal experience all around. The title of that panel presentation is the future is non-binary. Amanda, but she goes by Mandy Ralston, is a true thought leader and provocateur. And we are grateful she's a friend and a collaborator to Havas Health. And I could not be more thankful that she's our first presenter. Mandy is the founder and CEO of NonBinary Solutions. She is a serial entrepreneur and certified behavioral analyst. In her current role, she integrates data, technology, and evidence-based practices to drive change in treatment outcomes, equity, inclusion. Please join me in welcoming Mandy as our first Solve Sessions speaker. Thank you, Mandy.
Thank you, Brian. It's good to see you again.
You too.
All right. I have to record this computer stream. Open system precedents. All right.
Mandy, if it's helpful, you know that we're also recording on our end, if that makes things easier for you.
That's fine. It's asking me for permission to allow you to record, and I guess it's asking me, yeah. So let me see if I can. All right, let's pick a window here. All right, you guys are able to see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm glad I figured that out quickly. Yeah. Okay, so as Brian said, I'm Mandy Ralston. I'm the founder and CEO of NonBinary Solutions. I have been a 26-year clinician and quote-unquote expert in autism and neurodiversity. I built 2 different clinics here in Kentucky where I live. I sold the second clinic in 2019 to the 4th largest applied behavior analysis provider in the US. And that's when I learned about making clinical decision support software, which is what I'm doing now at NonBinary Solutions. Unlike building clinics, which I was doing for 2 decades, whereas I was able to use the profits from just use the profits to continue to grow the clinics over time. With NonBinary Solutions being a tech startup, I have to go about raising funds first, which is a very different business process, right? So I'm very accustomed to having to pitch to groups of investors in order to raise funds to go out and build a product, right? And so I have a very heterogeneous group of people that I tend to have to pitch to. They tend to be older white males. And so I get a lot of questions about, why did you name the company NonBinary Solutions, right? I get a lot of unsolicited feedback about, you should change the name of the company. It sounds weird. Is this something about sex? And so there are 3 main reasons that I named the company NonBinary Solutions, but we'll come back to that. First of all, let's talk about what is binary thinking, right? So binary thinking is also known as dichotomous thinking. So it's the notion that there are only 2 sides to some issue and you have to pick one, right? So this is like a false dichotomy, that you have to be on one side or the other of some issue or some other item that you're talking about, right? Why do we do it? Well, it feels good, right? And in situations where you may be highly anxious about trying to choose which side to be on something, moving through information quickly makes you feel good, right? So quickly categorizing something as either a yes or a no or stop or a go, etc., reduces anxiety. And that way we're able to move on to other issues more quickly. So let's talk about a list of potential binaries, right? Good, bad, male, female, man, woman, black, white, Republican, Democrat, citizen, foreigner, autistic versus neurotypical, pro-life or pro-choice, cat, dog, gay, straight, reinforcement versus punishment, fat versus thin, day versus night, addict versus sober, DC versus Marvel. My nephew asked me this recently. He said, "Are you a DC or a Marvel kind of person?" And I was like, "I don't know. Whatever Deadpool is, that's what I am." Professional or unprofessional, rich versus poor, success versus health, etc. How many of you guys, back to professional and unprofessional, how many of you have ever been given feedback about your style of hair or your tattoos or your piercings in a job setting that it may or may not be, quote, professional? That's a whole other talk show that we could go through on a different day about how professionalism is sort of a Trojan horse for all kinds of gatekeeping and othering, but I digress. So unhealthy or healthy, east, west, poly, mono, open, closed, in and out. So how do all these categories make you feel, right? Does they make you feel anxious or emboldened? Do they make you feel guilty or ashamed? Most people are not levelly one side or the other of all these things. They are an amalgamation of all of these different items, right? So creating a binary is unhelpful. The thing about categories is that categories move us toward a certainty, but away from clarity, right? So when you tend to make people into blacks and whites or quickly categorize them, you lose the shades of gray in between, right? And you lose the amplitude of the humanity of the individual that's standing in front of you. So putting people in categories is largely unhelpful. But we do this because it's rooted in childhood, right? And when we first start learning words, we might learn that something is a cat. And so quickly, anything that is fuzzy and has legs and a tail becomes a cat. Dogs are cats, cows are cats, everything's a cat. So you overgeneralize that simple discrimination initially. But then you learn to discriminate between dogs and cats. And so things very quickly become divided. It's either this or that. Also in school, we're taught this way, right? We're given multiple choice tests and there's only one right answer, right? We are teaching things that are either true or false. And in applied behavior analysis, we do a lot of this, teaching in categories for early intervention as well. But one thing that I've learned to ask myself when I see a binary, especially in social media, right, or media in general, is this Latin term, which is cui bono, which means who benefits. Who benefits from making this into a binary, right? Why would somebody want this to be a divisive thing? Is it distracting us from something else, right? Is it creating a divide within groups or in society, right? So yeah, I think that I've seen this more and more thanks to social media, that they want to put things into binaries. And you again have this anxiety-driven need to want to get on the right side of history. And so what I find is that people on the internet tend to have an opinion about almost anything, even though they haven't done the work of being educated to have an opinion about the thing, right? So one of the things that I try to teach people about these binaries is to slow down and question what's going on here, who benefits from this. Normally during this presentation, I go through about 100 or so years of the history of psychology and psychiatry, and to get us up to this point in 1950. So this is the Lavender Scare period, and that's when Joseph McCarthy, that's the asshole on the left, and Roy Cohn, that's the asshole on the right, were basically using fear mongering in order to accuse individuals within the US government of possibly being homosexual or part of the LGBTQ community. And they were using it to oust people and fire individuals. And it had long lasting effects on the lives of the people that were accused. And so that gives you context for when the DSM-1, the first version of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, comes out in 1952. When that first manual came out, this is the beginning of the modern classification of mental disorders. Homosexuality was included in the classification of mental disorders. And so I want you to have an understanding of this for the context of what happens later in the future, right? 1952, also, Alan Turing, seen here, who was the inventor of the modern computer, was arrested for gross indecency and engaging in homosexual behavior. And he was given a choice at the time to either be imprisoned or to undergo chemical castration, excuse me. And he chose the latter, which had devastating effects not only on his physiology, but also his psychology, his mental state. And Turing died by suicide later in 1954. So the United Kingdom spent years reconciling the treatments, or mistreatment, I should say, of LGBTQ plus individuals and what happened at the hands of these very pernicious laws. Most of you have probably been to a Pride festival at this point. I can't see everybody raising their hand. I usually ask for a raise of hands at this if you've been to a Pride festival or if you've been potentially forced into one through Target. But most people would recognize the individual on the left. That's Marsha P. Johnson, who is a Black transgender woman who was basically at the center of the Stonewall riots in 1969, which literally was the first showing of Pride in New York City. And so literally the first Pride was a riot, right? But what people may not know or face or maybe less familiar with is this fellow over here. Dr. John Myers was introduced to the crowd in 1972 at the American Psychiatric Convention. And he had on this, misshapen Richard M. Nixon mask that he and his lover had put together the night before. And he's wearing a suit that's 3 times too big. And he's got a device on the microphone to hide his voice. And he got in front of the entire Psychiatric Association to say the words, "I'm a homosexual and I am a psychiatrist." And his words changed the way that people within psychiatry and psychology started viewing homosexuality, right? So this change in the understanding of homosexuality from being pathologized to being understood as something as part of a spectrum of human behavior started in 1972 with Dr. Henry Anonymous here making this claim, right? And I give you all this information not because I am trying to recruit you into the alphabet mafia with me, but because I think there are parallels between the understanding and the change in the pathologization of homosexuality and what we're now seeing in the change, the understanding of autism and neurodiversity. So I've been asked for the last 25 years regularly, over and over and over again, what's going on with the rate of diagnosis of autism, right? Is it something in the food? Is it vaccines? Spoiler alert, it's not vaccines. That was false information. We don't believe that at all at any point, right? Is it that there actually is more autism? Is it better awareness? Is it better diagnosis? What's going on? Well, hashtag it's not binary. There's lots of things going on in this data. And I'm going to take you through that information so that you have an understanding that there's many different cultural, societal changes and technology changes that are sort of driving a flywheel here. I'll blow this up a little bit further for you, but over there, far left, you can see with the DSM-3, that is the 3rd version of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. In 1980, when that edition came out, that is the first time in history that autism is separated from childhood schizophrenia as a diagnosis. Okay, so you can see where the stigma of giving a child an autism diagnosis back in 1980 began, right? And consider the fact that medical doctors were probably operating off that same information of having proximity between autism and childhood schizophrenia based on their medical training from decades ago, right? But those are the folks that are in charge of screening and making referrals for further diagnostic evaluation to get a diagnosis of autism. And so probably for the first 15 years of my career working with individuals and families that had children with autism, I heard over and over stories of how pediatricians would say, "Oh, well, let's wait before we give this diagnosis, right? Let's let him develop a little bit more." And I say him because at the time it was believed that autism was 4 times more likely in boys than girls. Different talk show, we'll get onto that later. But so there was this reluctance to give the diagnosis, right? And part of that also had to do with the fact that there were very few services, there were very few providers, and it was expensive. Often when you got a diagnosis between 1970 and let's say 95, the pervading knowledge about what was going to happen for lifetime outcomes for an individual with autism, especially profound autism, is that they may be institutionalized at some point in their lives. That's the information people were operating off retrospectively. So right there after 1980, you see a new little dot around 1990, let's say, and it says 42% of Americans have a computer. Now, when I say computer, I mean something the size of a microwave, right? And it had one cord, and a cord that went into the outlet for power in the wall. There was no other phone cords going in and out of it, nothing. It had a floppy disk. It weighed, 50 pounds. The screen was black and the text was green, and it really didn't do much of anything. Okay, so those are computers in 1990. When you get to 1994, you see that the DSM-4 has come out at this point. And that is the new version of the autistic criteria for diagnosis. And there are now 5 different classifications or disorders within the DSM-4. So there's autism, there is pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, something called childhood disintegrative disorder, Rett's disorder, and Asperger's syndrome. So you have 5 different possible diagnoses within that book, that version. And then you see there in 1995, the CDC's retroactive data, understanding claims data, says that it was about 1 in every 1,000 individuals were diagnosed with autism in 1995. Now, also notably in 1995, says up there at the top, 3% of Americans have now used something called the World Wide Web, right? 3% of Americans have used something called the World Wide Web. Also, that's the year that Amazon.com opens in a garage, okay? Now, let's go to 1998. Historical data now says it's 1 in every 500 individuals. And this is when my certification board, the Behavior Analyst Certification Board, is first formed, because we're starting to understand that we need to have some kind of regulation around the practice of behavior analysis. But look at 2000. We are now 1 in every 150 individuals are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. And look what happened to the technology in that period of time. It says 78% of people have downloaded music. We went in a 5-year period to 3% of Americans logging onto the internet to now the overwhelming majority has downloaded music. And we're talking LimeWire, we're talking Napster, right? This is your mom screaming at you to get off the computer so she can use the phone, right? That's this technology. Look how fast of a rate of adoption for a technology that was in 5 years' time. Like, it's ubiquitous. It has changed the world. It has changed the way that the world operates now, having the internet, right? Keep going. 2001, we have our first state in the United States has mandatory coverage for autism treatment. It's Indiana, inexplicable. Different day, we'll talk about that. But we're still at 1 in every 150. By the time we get up to 2005, that's when Autism Speaks comes in, right? So it's formulated, and they come up with this whole campaign of awareness and support. They decide that April is Autism Month. They determine that April 2nd is World Autism Day. They come up with a campaign of Light It Up Blue. They make up the puzzle piece as the symbol for autism. They're controversial in certain circles at this point. I understand that. Say what you will about Autism Speaks, they got the word out, right? If you go look at the historical data for Google, every April, you will see that the searches for autism go 100 times over. They spike every single April, right? So they really got a campaign of understanding who are people with autism, who is this affecting? And so what's starting to happen because of the internet is that families are finding each other. They're saying, hey, your son sounds like my son. Your kid sounds like my kid. What are you doing for your kid? Oh, what is applied behavior analysis? How do I get that, right? What do you mean Indiana has it paid for through insurance? How can we get our state to pay for that, right? And so all of this is happening. It's just sort of pushing the flywheel, if you will. So by the time we get to 2007, we've got 3 states with coverage. And then the rate of diagnosis is about 1 in every 90, right? And then by the time we get to 2010, we have 23 states. Almost half of the United States has mandatory insurance treatment coverage. And at 2012, we only have 10,000 certified behavior analysts worldwide, okay? So you can see, like, this has gotten out of control very quickly. There's more, yes, there's more awareness. Doctors are now actually more likely to give the diagnosis because there are services, there is coverage and funding for it. We just don't have enough providers, right? In 2013, just to make things even more complicated, the DSM-5 comes out. And at that point, they get rid of those 5 different diagnoses, right? No more Asperger's, no more PDD-NOS, no more Rett disorder, no more childhood dissociative disorder. Everybody gets logged under one diagnosis code, which is F84.0, and it's just autism spectrum, right? So this is a problem. Now you've got a group of people all sharing one diagnosis code, and on one end of the spectrum, if you will, you've got folks that may be called into HR because they're perceived as being rude, and on the other end of the spectrum, you've got people that have profound autism, will need 24/7 care their entire lives, may not be able to communicate effectively, may engage in copious amounts of self-interest behavior, etc. Right? So you can see there the continued hockey stick. Right now, we are at 1 in every 32 individuals is going to be diagnosed with autism, and we have about 75,000 providers worldwide at this point. So you can see that this has been quite the phenomenon. My point being is, again, it's no one thing that's actually driving this increase. Hashtag it's not binary, right? More than one thing can be true and valid at the same time. And yes, correlation is not causation, but I would argue that these are strongly correlated points. So the thing about bias and binaries, right? When we evaluate and compare a range of data points, whether that data is related to health outcomes, head counts, or menu prices, we tend to neglect the relative strength of the evidence and treat it as a simple binary, right? So we just make something easy. The problem is that if you make those decisions frequently enough going through a binary with a situation, it slides from a binary just into a bias, which means that you're no longer actively thinking about it anymore. You just believe that the thing is true. And it sort of is lodged on your operating system of your brain, just under the surface there all the time. So there's lots of different types of biases. We'll go through a few of these, right? So confirmation bias is the notion that you will continue to collect data on a belief that you already have, right? So if you believe that people who drive Teslas are jerks, every time somebody in a Tesla cuts you off, you're going to be like, see, told you, jerks, right? FYI, I drive a Tesla, so I can say this. Dunning-Kruger effect. This is the notion that you perceive something as being simple because you know very little about the thing, right? So my favorite example of this is a company in England was surveyed all their employees, and it turned out that over half of the men in the company believed that if necessary, they would be able to land a commercial airliner, right? So be able to land a plane without any training, right? Or the other one was that over half of them believed that they would be able to return a serve from Venus Williams. Good luck. In-group bias is the notion that if somebody shares a belief or is part of a group that you approve of, you're more likely to agree with them on other things, right? So if you are a Lakers fan, right? Then anybody else that's a Lakers fan that you come up on, if they are also in the work group with you and they start to agree about something, you're more likely to agree with them because of the in-group bias, right? Self-serving bias is the notion that if I get an A on my test, it's because I studied hard and I'm a good student. If I got a C on the test, it's because the questions were too tricky and the professor didn't teach it well. Availability bias is the notion that you will make a decision based off the most recent information that you got. So you listen to a podcast on your drive to work, and now you suddenly think that you are very adept at being able to pick good stocks on Robinhood, right? Fundamental attribution error. This is anybody, if you're speeding down the highway, it's because you know that you are late getting to your child's practice of some sort, and it's very important that you be there. However, if somebody else speeds past you on the highway, it's because they're an asshole, right? That's fundamental attribution error. Hindsight bias is the notion that looking back, you can say, they should have done X, Y, and Z, right? Because you have a whole new data set about what the outcome was. I.e., wouldn't it have been a great idea if all of us would have worn masks back in February of 2020? That's hindsight bias, right? Anchoring bias is the notion that if you go to a used car dealership and you walk up to a car and the guy says, hey, you know what? That's a great looking vehicle. It's worth $25,000. But I tell you what, I'll give it to you for 15. Well, the car is only worth 12, but because the first piece of information that you got was that this was a $25,000 car, your bias now tells you that you're getting a great deal. That's anchoring bias. Optimism bias is generally the notion that if you're having a good day, you're going to view the world as being good. And pessimism bias is basically if you're having a bad day, you're going to view the world and information as being bad. The halo effect is the general sort of, if you got a home run with one thing in your organization, then the whole organization tends to have a halo of goodness around it. The best example of this is Apple, right? See this thing on my wrist? This is the world's most expensive phone finder, right? As a watch, big deal. But everybody goes out and they buy all the Apple things immediately. Next phone comes out, got to have the next phone, right? Because the halo around Apple products in general, right? Status quo bias, you probably are familiar with this. This is the notion of that's the way we've always done it, right? Which Admiral Grace Hopper would argue is the most dangerous phrase in any organization, right? Innovation stops when you go with the status quo. So here's the thing. Even binaries are not all bad, right? If I said that all binaries were bad, that would be binary. So you've got to have some binaries to move through the world quickly in a lot of circumstances. You need to determine quickly whether you put the foot on the gas and the brake. You need to determine quickly whether you should say yes to the person that just offered you a drink or ask you out on a date. So yes, even some binaries are not binary. But here's some potential remedies or workarounds for these issues, right? The first and biggest one is to reclaim empathy, to try to put yourselves in somebody else's shoes, right? And I see this again with social media, this sort of rabid need to pile on to an issue and judge people and shame people. And I want you to imagine yourselves as being unable to ever defend yourself or the context for which you were operating when you made a bad choice, right? That would feel terrible. And so when you see somebody that has made a choice that you think is questionable, stop yourself and say, maybe what context has this person been in that would drive them to make this particular type of choice, right? Rather than judging, get curious about the context that that person has, right? What is their particular history of reinforcement and punishment that might have motivated them or even reinforced them to make certain decisions. Some of you may be familiar with the parable of the Zen master and the little boy, right? So it goes like this. The little boy's 15th birthday and he gets a horse. And the whole village says, how wonderful. But the Zen master says, we'll see. And then a couple of years later, the boy falls off the horse and breaks his leg. And the whole village says, how terrible. And the Zen master says, we'll see. And then a couple more years later, war breaks out and all the young men are recruited off to battle, except for the little boy, because he has a permanent limp from falling off the horse. So you can see that it's the context that makes things good or bad, right? I had this sort of similar issue whenever I sold my clinic back in 2019. I didn't particularly want to sell at the time that I did, but 6 months later, I didn't have to make payroll in a pandemic. And my goodness, I was happy, right? So employee will see when others, not only when bad things happen to you, but also when good things happen to you. Let the context shape it. Similarly, the School of Life out of London uses the phrase for now to reframe things as not polarized black and white, good or bad, right? So I can't stand this job for now, right? i.e., this is going to change in all likelihood, right? Or I found the perfect partner for me for now, right? That very well may change over time as well. So reframing things as not being inherently good or bad by using for now, understanding that the nature of the thing may change over time is very helpful in avoiding binaries. Anytime somebody asks me, how are you? I say, good enough. And most of the time, people get a real kick out of it, right? They say, I like that. I'm going to start using that. Why? Because it's a very skillful tact, right? It tells you everything you know in a very short piece of short phrase, right? It's like nobody likes it when you answer honestly to "How are you?" and you start off with, "Oh, I didn't sleep so well. My girlfriend just broke up with me," and it's like people don't want to hear that as an answer because then it requires follow-up questions and feigning attention and all the other things. So this is a highly effective way of replying to "How are you?" Um, Another workaround here is Hanlon's razor, which says never attribute to malice that which can be adequately explained by incompetence, i.e., they weren't trying to hurt you, they're just incompetent, right? So Hanlon's razor is a reframe to not be so irritated, aggravated, angry at certain actions that you may be confronted with, work, life, social media, all of it, right? It wasn't malice. They just have a completely different context. They're not working with the same data set that you may be. Also, be aware of the fact that there is no such thing as normal. There is only common to rare, right? And so I think what I love most about the younger generations, I'm Gen X, so the generations after me, are the fact that they are very much blowing up the systems that I've grown up in. So they're blowing up gender, they're blowing up sexuality, they're blowing up capitalism, right? And so the thing that is quote unquote normal is getting further and further dispersed across a line. And I think that's a wonderful thing because I think that creates more overlap and more humanity that we can actually see each other as humans. Keep in mind that it is okay to say, I don't know. I don't have enough information on that right now. I need to do more research before I weigh in. I need more data. How strong is this data? And where did this data or information came from, right? You are allowed to say all those things because there are 1,000 wrong answers. I don't know is not one of them, right? You do not have to have an opinion about everything. And anybody that tells you that you do is operating in a binary. So cui bono. So I like to say that we want to engage in full spectrum thinking, right? So not just black and white, but we want to see the full amplitude of the potential of human beings, all the colors in the rainbow. Or if you want to, you can be super spectrum and be more mantis shrimp, right? So these things can see in 12 channels the color, whereas humans can only see in 12, or I'm sorry, in 3. Humans can only see 3, they can see 12. They're super interesting creatures. I highly recommend you Google them. All right. So 1998 is when we get to the term neurodiversity. An Australian psychologist named Judy Singer coins this term. And she says that neurodiversity refers to the natural variation in human brain function and behavioral traits, recognizing that neurological differences are a normal part of human diversity. Several different conditions that are under this umbrella of neurodiversity: autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, that's me, dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, obsessive compulsive disorder, and synesthesia, which is a personal favorite of mine. That's the individuals that will tell you that they can hear color or taste sound, right? Like that letter sounds blue. So the neurodiversity movement advocates for acceptance, understanding, and support for neurodivergent individuals rather than attempting to cure or change their neurological makeup. This approach emphasizes creating an inclusive environment that accommodate neurodiverse individuals and harnessing the unique talents and perspectives of those folks. Now, it's important to note while neurodiversity celebrates neurological difference, it does not dismiss the challenges that some neurodivergent individuals may face. Instead, it promotes a balanced view that recognizes both strengths and potential difficulties associated with various neurological conditions. This is definitely the spirit of the movement. I will tell you that this is not always achieved by some of the individuals within the movement. There are some very binary thinking individuals within the neurodiversity movement that tend to forget that they have to also consider those individuals that may not be able to advocate for themselves, i.e. those people with profound autism in some cases. Yeah, so you really, again, have to consider that that autism diagnosis that we're now talking about that has a bunch of very, very, very different people in there, has a very full spectrum of abilities and unique talents. Some key aspects here. One, neurodiversity acknowledges that each person's brain processes information uniquely. Usually if I can see people raising their hands, I'll ask things about whether you guys are team shoes on or shoes off. I personally cannot stand to not be wearing shoes. It drives me crazy to walk around barefoot. Other people find shoes highly restrictive and can't stand it. Like they can't wait for summer to be outside with their shoes off. That's a very broad range of just one sensory experience about how we process information uniquely, right? Or ask somebody the steps to brushing their teeth, right? Some people wet the toothbrush first and then put the toothpaste on, and some people put the toothpaste on and then wet it, and some people do all three. It's all different. Emphasizing and recognizing the strengths associated with different neurological conditions rather than focusing solely on the challenges. So we take a strengths-based approach. The neurodiversity paradigm opposes the idea that certain forms of neurodivergence needs to be cured or fixed. And so this is where some of the hashtag actually autistic self-advocates are very, very vehement about their autism and that they do not need to be cured or fixed. And they've had some very strong things to say in some circumstances about applied behavior analysis. And I will tell you that the criticisms of applied behavior analysis are not unwarranted. There's lots of things about the practice that needed to be changed. But again, hindsight bias, things that we did 20 years ago, we no longer do. So as with any good science, as new data comes to light, we tend to change our practices, right? The neurodiversity movement advocates for the full societal inclusion and respect for neurodivergent individuals. Neurodivergence can be either innate, such as autism, dyslexia, those other disorders, or acquired through experience, such as trauma or meditation practices. Collectively, neurodivergent people make up about 15 to 20% of the total population. Right now in the US, it's about 3% of the population is diagnosed with autism, 9% is diagnosed with ADHD, and if you want to include intellectual and developmental disabilities, you're talking upwards of 35 to 40% of the US population. Neurodiversity in the workplace involves recognizing and accommodating different cognitive styles, this potentially leading to increased innovation and productivity. So just some brief shots here, some different people you may recognize with some of these different mental classifications. ADHD, dyslexia, yeah, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, Tourette syndrome, OCD, and synesthesia. So here's some neurodiversity affirming practice guidelines. Here again, what I want you to take away from this most of all is if you look down at the bottom of the slide, the place where I pulled this from is called stempunks.org, which I think is hilarious as a play on steampunks, but that's just me. Some of the practices include one, that you presume competence. Just because somebody has a diagnosis or shares traits with individuals on the neurodivergent spectrum, you should not assume that they're incompetent in any given area. We would want to promote autonomy for all individuals that are affected with neurodivergent conditions, that we would respect all communication styles. You might notice that I speak rather rapidly. Other folks on the neurodivergent spectrum may have difficulty communicating verbally. They may have difficulty with eye contact. They may use sign language or an augmentative communication system in some cases, right? So respect all communication styles. In order to be neurodiversity affirming, we want to try to be informed by neurodivergent voices, right? So asking the opinions of the people who are actually affected by neurodivergent conditions rather than making assumptions as a potentially neurotypical, right? Taking a strengths-based approach, as we already discussed, Honoring neurodivergent culture. There is a very strong culture, especially within the autism culture. I encourage you to go check out those spaces. There'll be a stalker, like ask to be invited in, but take a look and see how those folks like to operate when they're in their best and happiest, relaxed and engaged states. And then finally, tailoring supports to individual needs, which I think we're going to talk about here a little bit in my next few slides. Do want to point out this notion of intersectional invisibility, right? And this is the notion that often people that share more than one minority status are not viewed as the full non-binary version of themselves, right? So they may get pegged simply as their race, or they may get pegged simply as their gender, or they may get pegged simply as their nationality, when in fact the full individual includes all of these things as a Venn diagram. They have an intersectional life, right? So they're not just one thing, they are the sum of all their parts. Yeah, so neurodiversity at work, some things that you might employ or you might want to see in your organizations if you're working with individuals with neurodiversity. Physical environment and adjustments, offering noise canceling headphones or quiet workspaces to reduce sensory overload, providing adjustable lighting options, creating a designated quiet area or private rooms, allowing for flexible seating arrangements and ergonomic equipment, offering flexible scheduling and remote work options, providing clear written instructions and expectations, allowing for uninterrupted work time and breaks as needed, and using assistive technology like speech-to-text software or digital planners. For me, again, as an example, if you give me a long employee manual to read, I probably won't sit still and read it. However, if you give me something that will make text-to-speech and I can listen to it as an audiobook, if you will, I'm more likely to absorb that information in an auditory manual. Improve communication and training, right? Conduct awareness training for managers and co-workers about neurodiversity, provide ongoing mentorship and skills training for neurodivergent employees, communicate clearly and avoid abstract language, i.e. don't say things like, don't bend over backwards for this person, because a very literal thinker will say, why on earth would I ever bend over backwards, right? And offer multiple formats of information such as visual, verbal, and written. For your hiring practices, rethink your recruitment process to be more inclusive. So don't just have a single funnel as to how you find potential employees, right? Train interviewers on neurodiversity so they understand why this person may be fidgeting nonstop during the interview or prefer to take a walk when you're actually doing the interview rather than sitting down at a table, or that they might avoid eye contact, or that their style of dress might be different than somebody might deem as professional. I can tell you that one of my very first clients, who's an adult now, works in a large organization. He's a brilliant statistician, but he got called into HR because he was wearing Hawaiian shirts and shorts often into the office, and they wanted to have a talk with him about quote unquote professionalism. And he couldn't understand what the problem was because, as far as he was concerned, his shirt was ironed and clean every day and he showered every day. And so he didn't understand what the point was. And frankly, I don't either. But again, different talk show. Focus on leveraging unique strengths of the neurodivergent employees. And we'll go through a list of those here in a second. But to give you some examples of some companies that are doing this well, EY has been a pioneer of neurodiversity hiring for some time. They have a specialized onboarding process for their neurodivergent employees. They actively promote neurodiversity-powered transformation to its clients, so they're using it to signal to their customers and clients that they believe this is part of their secret sauce, right? SAP also has fully embraced the neurodiversity movement. They developed the Autism at Work program, which provides ongoing support for their neurodivergent employees. And that program focuses on embracing different ways of thinking and training managers to create a supportive work environment. IBM has also been doing this for a while. They partnered with the group, their Special Stern. I can't figure out exactly how to say that, but that is a Dutch nonprofit group that works to place neurodivergent employees throughout the world with different companies. I think they're in 26 countries at this point. IBM developed the ND at IBM Business Resource Group, which has over 1,400 members. And they also are the ones that came up with the hashtag actually autistic. I think that's been co-opted on the internet at this point. I'm pretty sure not all of those people are working for IBM, but there's quite a bit of chatter about actually autistic. So yeah, looking at the strengths of your neurodivergent staff, they are likely to be creative and out-of-the-box thinkers. Some of them may have very strong attention to detail, depending on their particular condition. Some of the folks with the neurodivergent spectrums are going to have amazing pattern recognition and analytical skills. Some of us are going to be able to hyper-focus if we're really interested on the thing that we're working on. You may get some very unique perspectives because they have a very different lived experience of the world, right? They typically have a strong work ethic and loyalty for some of the neurodivergent conditions, that is. They are quite honest in some cases and very direct, which is good. You don't have to wonder about what your employees might be thinking. So they'll let you know if they want to give you some feedback on some things. So yeah, I tend to think of neurodiversity as an evolutionary process, that getting all these very different types of people and types of thinkers into a room together is sort of the way that you get innovation, right? It's a way of harmonizing differences between people, that you can see the strengths, even though that people may do things differently that you think you might do them in the same circumstance. And it's also a way of harboring resilience, right? I think about the utility of all the neurodivergent workers during the pandemic, right? It's like, who better to sit alone in an office and not have any coworkers around them than people that prefer to be alone in the first place. And a lot of individuals with autism prefer to work alone, right? Or who better to deal with a very overstimulating environment that has constant alerts and notifications and whistles and bells, right? Than people with ADHD that typically have to filter all that out anyway, because that's how the world sort of feels to them, so they can hyper focus on a thing. Or who better to implement all the safety and health protocols in a pandemic than somebody who has a proclivity towards obsessive compulsive behavior related to keeping things orderly, right? So I think there's a real argument for the conclusion of embracing our quirky brains, right? That this is a way of furthering the species by having variations in the way that we think and how we move through sensory information in the world. So back to the original question, which was, why did I name my company Non-Binary Solutions, right? Again, I get a lot of that non-solicited feedback about, why did you name the company this? It sounds weird. You should change the name of the company. Well, three main reasons. One, as we've said, people are not black and white. They are shades of gray. And in order to treat and support individuals, you have to see the full amplitude of their humanity. Two, because the founders of Apple, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, purportedly had an argument at some point because Jobs was curmudgeonly, I think, to say the least, to work for in some cases. And so Wozniak said to Jobs, it's not binary. You can be both brilliant and decent at the same time. And then thirdly, and most importantly, I get to talk on stages a lot these days, and I get to say this. Did you know that people on the spectrum are 6 times more likely to not identify with the gender they were assigned at birth, right? And so now I have given you new data, new information. So if you care about individuals on the spectrum, you also now have to care about individuals that are non-binary and trans, because those 2 points overlap. So it's a way for me to create empathy, especially in a time in the world that we've got a lot of really hateful legislation that's hurting kids. It's a way for me to really educate people and try to make the world a better place. So thank you guys very much for your kind attention. I'm going to turn my slides off and turn my camera back on so I can see you. If you want to use that QR code, you're welcome to check out nonbinarysolutions.com, which also has a link to our software, which is called noetic.ai. And yeah, you also can follow me on social media. I like to say that I am vaguely professional on LinkedIn. I am mostly authentic on Instagram, and I am completely unhinged on Facebook. So choose your poison. Thank you very much. And let me turn this sharing back off.
My poison is all of the above, Mandy.
I get a glimpse of you every once in a while, Brian. I appreciate it. What up, John?
Hello, hello.
Good to see you.
Hi,
Hey,
Mandy.
Kat. How are you?
It's going well. I was smiling when you were showing the timeline because I was born in 1973. So you can imagine how, um, like, they didn't even have really a clear diagnosis until I was an adult. I graduated in high school in 1992.
Wow. Yeah.
So when I was diagnosed as autistic in 97, and if you look, because I've gone through the diagnosis twice, because after COVID, what people don't tell you is sometimes life events will change your makeup and what happens in your brain. And in this case, my sensitivities to sensory stimuli changed after COVID. And I had to go back and redo the testing just to see what had changed.
That's wild. Do you want to share what had changed?
So my auditory processing got worse.
Yeah.
Because you know how some people, when they had COVID, they lost their sense of taste or smell. Well, my sensitivities, particularly around auditory and visual, amped.
Wow.
That it turned up the dial.
Yeah.
To the point where I had a panic attack. So it was one of those things where the complete change in the environment, because I'd been existing fine in the workplace without an issue. And then I had COVID and everything changed. And all of a sudden I started having to be more mindful of self-care. And I had to start wearing my Apple Watch and using my app to study my stress monitoring, to pay attention to what in the environment was freaking me out, because I didn't know. It was crazy.
Yeah, just a little self-behavior analysis, right?
Exactly.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, the pandemic was such a reset for all of us in different ways, right? It's like the people that we were going into it and the people that we are coming out of it, totally different. And depending on what age you were, how much that's going to impact your trajectory over a lifetime, right? It's like I feel so bad for the high school kids that went through that. It's like that's rough. That's a rough period of time to go through that.
yep, my oldest son, graduated during the pandemic. And he didn't get to experience any of the fun graduation stuff that like when I talk about my graduation, I have different stories. He doesn't have those because his was behind a screen.
Yeah. Hey, I want to send a shout out here to Carol and Julia for being exceptional and holding my hand as I tumbled over the finish line to get to this presentation. They were very patient with me as I almost got my dates mixed up last weekend. So thank you guys. You've been really excellent to work with.
It was great. Very interesting. Thank you so much.
Good.
Yes, thank you so
Yeah.
much, Mandy. Amazing.
Thank you guys. Any other questions, dedications, requests?
All right. I think we're good. Thank you again, Mandy. Greatly appreciate it.
Of course.
Absolutely.
Enjoy.
Thank you, everybody.
Mandy, if
Bye-bye.
you have 5 minutes, give me a call.
Yeah, I'll call you.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mandy. See you soon.